Hey everybody, this is Dave Dugdale, learningvideo.com. About 5 or 6 years ago, I did a variable ND shootout where, you could take the ND and you could rotate it and it'll change its value of ND. Here, I'm doing a shootout of a lot of different ones that are solid or fixed. You can't change the value. The values are between 1.2 and 1.8, so about 4 to 6 stops. You can go even higher. But the reason I'm doing it to these long lenses, like a 7200 and the Sony 1-400. For this situation, these are the filter size for this one is 77 millimeters. The reason is because of this. When you put it, most of the time when you put a variable ND on these, depending on which variety, you will not, in most cases, not always, but you will not be able to put the lens hood back on. And when you're shooting, like it's say in a pool deck environment where light is bouncing off the pool deck, coming back into your lens, you don't have a lens hood on, it really lowers the contrast and you might not get the type of images that you're looking for, depending on what angle you are from the sun. So having a fixed one with the lens hood, I like doing, and I wanted to go through a shootout because the NDs that I've been using for a while, I've bought some cheap ones, and that's a good one. It's like, oh, I better just go through a bunch of different ones and see what happens. So this, I guess, review is more geared towards the Sony color science because I would think you'd get maybe slightly different results from like, Nikon, Canon, Panasonic, something like that. And one of the things I wanted to do with these is with the variable NDs, a lot of times you'll get a lot of problems from weird vignetting to more color cast. Usually with these type of fixed ones, you have less of those issues. And with the Sony cameras being a bit fickle in terms of their color science and getting it right in post, I don't want to add more complexity by adding in a bad filter and creating more problems and then spending more time in post. So with that being said, I've looked at a lot of different ones here, and I'll cut right to the chase. There is basically 2 really good ones out of all these that I've done. This one right here is the Benro. I own Benro tripods. I didn't even know they made ND filters, and when I was going through the B&H page on all the different ND filters, like, oh, Benro, I'll give it a try. I threw it into the cart. These are all provided by B&H. I have to send them back after 30 days. And the other one that worked really well was this particular Hoya. I got 2 different Hoyas, but this one was called the Professional IRND. I'll put all the links down below. These 2 by far were way ahead of all the competition. A lot of these tests sometimes you'll do is like, I don't see any difference, but these really stood out in terms of sharpness, the bokeh, the color cast, which is one of the most important things I wanted to have as neutral as possible where I didn't have to do any color correction later in post. These 2 definitely stood out from the crowd. So let's go through all the different filters that I did pick. Since I have owned Tiffin in the past, and in fact that variable ND shootout I did 5 or 6 years ago, I ended up buying a Tiffin. So I thought, oh, they should be good, right? Well, no. For some reason, I gotta say these are probably the worst ones out of all of the ones that I've tested. And I've tested ones that are way cheaper than these Tiffin ones that I got. These provided so much green color cast. I'll show you an example of how much color cast these introduced. So right off the bat, I took these out of the running. I mean, I did look at other things like the bokeh and some other things, but for the most part, they were out of the running quite quickly. In fact, some of the other Tiffins that I own, I put into the mix with a different filter size, and I plan on getting rid of those as well because I was like, wow, they introduce a lot of green in the image. So those are out of the running. All right, next up is Breakthrough. I took this one out of the running quite quickly. I ran into an issue. Let me explain what was happening. So I was going downstairs in my basement. I put a white sheet up, put some lights on it that are fluorescent lights, and I basically was looking for vignetting across all of these. It wasn't bad in terms of vignetting, but what happened was I was creating what's called, I believe, Newton rings. They're basically concentric rings into the image. It was overlaying. It's kind of like moire or aliasing. Some sort of artifact was being added to the image. I was like, this is weird. So I contacted Breakthrough, and they're actually, I think, they have an office here in Colorado, down in Denver. And boom, in a couple days, they sent me another one. And I was thinking, because maybe it was a bad ND, or something. You know, it was a nice clean ND. It didn't have anything on it or scratches or anything like that. I tried another one, and it had the same problem. And I was like, well, why might I try changing the focus? It was still there. I tried changing the aperture. It was still there. I tried changing the shutter speed. It was still there. I was like, this is really odd. So I thought, well, let me change out the lighting fixture altogether. So I turned off the fluorescence, turned on an LED light, and the problem was gone. And I was like, well, maybe it has to do with, you know, the frequency, because sometimes when you use LEDs, you can get banding and stuff. If you change the shutter speed, you can kind of dial it in to where you can get rid of that kind of banding or artifact happening into the image. So I went back to the fluorescence, changed the shutter speed around again, and no change. I was like, that's really odd. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Dave, you use an ND filter when you're shooting outside, and that's so true. The reason I took it out of the running is there are occasions where I'm using an ND filter, maybe not so much outside, but maybe there's indoor lighting involved somewhere in the shot, and I didn't want to have those concentric rings inside that part of the shot. And it's one of those things that I think will probably happen down the road. Besides that, it seemed like a pretty decent filter. Just because of that one item, I was like, all right, I'm gonna take it out of the running. All right, next up that I took out of the running are these Formatt, I believe, Formatt High Tech. There's a 1.2 and a 1.8, so 4-stop, 6-stop version. These I took out of the running because the white balance, in terms of, I was shooting a chart outside, I'll show it to you right here, and basically it required a curve where it had too much cyan in the highlights to get rid of or make it more neutral. So it was looking correct on the charts that I was shooting outside. So I took these out of the running. I mean, if it was just one thing where I was like, oh, it's too magenta globally over the entire image or too green over the entire image, I could change the tint slider basically in Resolve and quite easily fix that. It was just a little bit off, but these were just off in just one part, just to the highlights. And so I was like, I'm gonna take these out of the running as well. All right, next up is the B+W. This one was actually not too bad. It wasn't green or too magenta. It was just too blue in the midtones and highlights. And again, it required kind of a curve adjustment to make this work. Besides that, it was a great ND filter, but it's just like, too much work. I'm taking it out of the running. All right, next up is Ice. This one's the cheapest one, coming in around $30. The other ones I haven't talked about prices yet. They're for the most part, they're like from $70 to $130, somewhere in that range. This one, a lot cheaper. Now, in terms of what I was going for, in terms of picking stuff on B&H, just to get in as loaners, I just wanted to get a wide variety and maybe pick something that somebody else hasn't reviewed yet. That's what's great about YouTube, is you can watch a review like this and you can get a whole different set of ND filters that maybe somebody else has reviewed comparison wise. I thought this was kind of great because the price was low, and who knows, I've done other tests before where the cheapest one actually works really well and I could recommend it. But this one I can't recommend because it was too magenta in the midtones and then it was too green in the highlights. So it was doing something really funky there. Again, I had to kind of create a curve adjustment just on the colors alone to make this one work. So I took this one out of the running. So that leads us back to these two that we talked about earlier, the Benro and the Hoya. So let me just go through all the different tests. And I've done these tests multiple times and I've gotten different results. And this is one of the things that happens with this type of stuff. So like I said, I'm doing this with Sony cameras. Your results might vary a little bit different if you're using a different type of camera. The first thing that I tested was vignetting. In terms of vignetting, the Hoya actually beats out the Benro ever so slightly when it comes to vignetting. The Benro had a little bit more vignetting. It wasn't much. There was others that were worse when I was going through all of them. But it was just slightly, the Benro had a little bit more darkening in the corners. The next thing I wanted to compare between these two, actually I compared with all of them, was Bokeh. Because sometimes I did that review I did about 6 years ago. There was one called Lightcraft Fader ND Mark II that I looked at and actually introduced some weird hatched kind of patterns into the Bokeh. But I shot all of these, as you can see these examples here, and all of them look great. There wasn't introducing anything weird within like those bokeh balls that you see there, where it's basically just out of focus Christmas lights. But I did test it in a lot of different outdoor situations where, like you see here, the light coming off the lake The Bokeh on both the Benro and the Hoya look pretty much identical. There was only one test I did where I was shooting some green leaves, and actually the Benro looked better in terms of the Bokeh than the Hoya, but it was a very minimal difference between the two. One of the things I wanted to test between these two is sharpness. Is one sharper or one duller than the other? And as you can see from this example here, they were pretty much identical. They were very sharp. I didn't run a sharpness test on all of these, but I have seen some ND filters in the past kind of not be as sharp as definitely the naked lens with no ND filter. Now, one of the biggest things I wanted to test with these ND filters was color cast. I wanted one that didn't introduce any color cast and would work even with automatic white balance when I'm outside. Because a lot of times when I'm shooting run and gun and there's clouds coming in and out, or like a wispy cloud, and all of a sudden a big dark cloud comes in and the temperature is just changing greatly, I want the camera to do that. And sometimes I just don't have time to dial it in myself to taste and get it the way I want it to look, especially if it's a cloudy day and it's changing rapidly all over the place. So I wanted to look at these both not only for automatic white balance, but how well they do on a blue sunny day when I set the white balance to daylight, or like around 5600. In some tests, the Benro one, like this test right here that I'm showing you in the boats, the Hoya was a little bit too warm, and then some cases the Hoya one, and probably the one that I'm looking at the most, giving the most value to, is this one where I have the swimming pool, and both the Benro and the Hoya are really close. Let me show you what's not close. Here's the Tiffin. Remember I was saying how green the Tiffin was? Look how bad the Tiffin is. I can't believe, and I've owned Tiffin ND filters, and I got to tell you, I'm probably going to sell all of them and buy either Benro or Hoya, because I was really surprised just how green those Tiffin filters were. But it was kind of a toss-up, but I would say the overall winner in terms of color cast, both for daylight and automatic white balance in the pool environment, which was really important to me because of the greens and the blues in the pool. I didn't want those shifting around as drastically as like the Tiffin does. All right, a few other things to consider really quickly is just like a lot of times what will happen is you'll have your lens hood in one hand and you're trying to screw the filter on with the other hand, with one hand basically. And a lot of times it's mounted on a tripod, you're doing it this way. Obviously this way is a lot easier, you let gravity help you out. But I would say the Hoya, every time I did it, and although I just didn't do it right the first time on this one, the Hoya is a lot easier to do with one hand. The Benro is a little bit thinner, and for some reason that it takes 2 or 3 attempts before you get the threads to match. Obviously, you don't want to force it and cross thread it, but I would say the Hoya, in terms of putting it on, is actually easier than the Benro. Now, another thing that's different between the Hoya and the Benro is the Hoya, at least it lists it on the website as it says it's an IRND, means infrared. I guess it provides infrared protection. Now I'm using Sony cameras here. I didn't see any difference between the two filters. But if you're using Blackmagic, some of the older Blackmagic cameras from I understand, is if you had maybe like a red shirt in the image and you're shooting outside with an ND filter on and it didn't have this IR built into it, basically what happened, it'll take that red shirt and turn it kind of brown, or kind of a muddy brown color, and it wouldn't look right. It would alter the colors, especially the reds from what I understand. I don't own any Blackmagic cameras right now, so I can't test this, but if you own a Blackmagic camera and you're shooting on a long lens like this, maybe get the Hoya over the Benro. Then, I don't know if this is like any big deal for you guys, but in terms of cleaning these, basically just spray a little bit and use a microfiber cloth to clean them off, which happens a lot because you're going to get your fingerprints on these when you're putting them on and off. The Benro is easier to clean than the Hoya. Now, I'm no optical genius here and stuff, but the Benro talks about having 13 coatings, and it even talks about how it's easier to clean because it has 13 coatings on each side. Whereas the Hoya says it's non-coated. So this one was harder to clean, if that means anything to you guys. It takes maybe another 10 seconds longer to clean it. It's not that big of a deal, but as you're rubbing it off, you're like, oh, there's still residue there. I didn't do it right. And you flip over your microfiber cloth and you do it again. It's like, all right, maybe it's a little bit better. And then you keep doing it. Whereas the Benro, it pretty much cleaned up great the first time I cleaned it. So that might be something else you want to keep in mind. So that's pretty much it. What I'll probably do is make this as a part 1, and then part 2 is, now that I've got 2 ND filters, or maybe I'll just pick one that I really like, I'll get different values of it, and then get in some variable ND filters that are out today. Maybe the ones not from 6 years ago, but the ones that are out today, and maybe I'll compete with these type of ones to see if the variable NDs that are out today can work well. Again, maybe I'll be able to find a variable ND that'll actually allow me to put my lens hood on. If you know of one, let me know, because I don't know of any ones that let you do that, because it kind of makes it a little bit thicker right there, and you can't put the lens hood on, at least for the Sony cameras. So that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.